All right, welcome back. This is the fourth program in our accelerated NLP training series. And we're going to begin this series by giving you information and techniques that you can use during your day-to-day activity. So this marks a departure from where we've been going before, because previously what we've been doing is simply giving you information. And now we're actually going to get into what do you do out there in the real world. And I'd like to begin by talking about sensory acuity and about observing other people. So let's turn to page 15. In modeling Dr. Milton Erickson, the creators of NLP observed that people actually do make minute changes from moment to moment, and that those changes have meaning if you have enough sensory acuity. Now, what is sensory acuity? Actually, when they taped Erickson, and at one point he was saying, I looked over at that woman, and they said, how did you know she was in trance? And he said, well, I observed that she was in trance because the beating of the pulse on her ankle slowed down. Now, he was about as far from her as I am from you. And yet, all that distance, he could observe the change in the beating of the pulse in her ankle. Now, not a lot of people know this, but Erickson had polio, and he was bedridden at age 18. Actually, that was one of the things that they first began to wonder. They said, are we going to have to, have polio in order to be as good as Milton Erickson when they began to model him? But the fact is, of course, that we don't, fortunately. We don't have to have that, but we do have to have really good sensory acuity. Erickson learned how to walk by watching his baby sister learn how to walk. And he was already 18 when she began to walk. So Erickson had really, really great powers of observation. And he could see things that other people couldn't see. He had the great ability to observe and notice minute changes that people make from moment to moment. And so essentially in NLP, what we did is we sort of codified those. Now, there's a lot of different things that you can look at. There are a lot of different things that you can begin to look at. You can look at the entire body of the person, but let me give you some things, which, if you pay attention to those, will make a big difference in your ability to notice what's going on in other people. Now, some of the people listening may have a don't look to talk rule. And some of you may have a solid look to talk rule. Like, my mom always said, look me in the eyes when you're talking to me. And so it became impossible to break my eye contact. But the fact is, with NLP, we want you to look at every single bit of the other person. We want you to look at the person's body. We want you to look at their breathing. We want you to look at everything that's going on at the same time, so that you'll be able to have and be able to pick up that great sensory acuity, that what is going on with the other person at all times. The better your sensory acuity, the better you'll be able to see and notice if the information that you're giving to the other person is going in and is being received well. If you notice the information is being received well, that's perfect. You don't need to do anything, simply keep communicating. And if you notice that it isn't being received well, then what do? Of course, you change your behavior. You communicate a little bit differently. Now, who wouldn't like to communicate better? I mean, think about it for just a minute. Master communicators of all time have had the ability to notice things in the people they're communicating with and change their communication if it wasn't getting through. I remember one time I was talking to this guy and talking to this guy and talking to this guy, and I noticed all of a sudden that I really wasn't getting through. And I thought to myself, boy, I better change my behavior quickly. Remember our 5 principles for success, and one of them is to have enough sensory acuity to notice what's going on out there, to notice what's going on with the person that you're communicating with. So if you're sitting there and you're talking to someone and the communication isn't getting through, boy, oh boy, you got to change, and you've got to shift gears and move into another state. But how are you going to notice? So the process of observing other people on page 15 and sensory acuity is really the basis for everything we do in NLP. It's the basis, it's the observational basis for being able to know whether or not we're communicating in a way which will produce the kind of results we want to produce. I promise you, if you pay attention to this, it'll make you into a master communicator, whether you're working with groups or individuals, whether you're working one-on-one or with groups of people, and whether you're working in business or education or therapy. The ability to have sensory acuity has made a major difference in my life, to be able to look across at people and know, yes. I mean, in my own mind, yes, this person's getting it. He's really with me in terms of what I'm saying. Or to have another situation where you sit there and you're going, this person really isn't with me. I remember one time I was sitting across, I was actually trying to enroll a bank in our business consulting program that we did. And I was talking with her for about 45 minutes about meta programs, which are a master practitioner process. And I wanted to talk to her about using the meta programs in hiring. And how would you actually use this hiring? I was saying, well, it's very good. And I noticed after about 45 minutes, she wasn't really with anything that I was saying. And I stopped the whole presentation and I said to her, look, it occurs to me that you're really not with what I'm saying. So let me give you a demonstration. Well, that was the best thing I ever did. Because she said at that point, she said, you're right. I'm really not buying anything you're saying. By stopping and shifting gears and giving her a demonstration of how it worked, it really, really, really made a big difference. And all I did was pay attention to her skin color, her skin tonus, the breathing, the lower lip size, and the eyes, the pupil dilation and the focus. All of that's on page 15. And what we noticed, of course, as Milton Erickson's most specifically was one of the great observers, that he could observe things in people that most people couldn't even see. And so we began to wonder, what is it that Erickson was doing? So, in my opinion, these are the most important parts of sensory acuity, but the fact is you could observe in a person's entire body. You don't have to observe just these 5 things, observe everything. But pay attention mostly to these, and these will give you a lot of information. Now, before we actually get into these, let me talk about calibration. Calibration itself, and this is an NLP term, is the comparison of 2 different things. For example, if I were going to look at somebody, be in a certain state, I could take a mental picture of that if I was visual. I could take a mental picture of that and then hold that picture in my mind and compare what I'm seeing presently to that picture. Imagine for a moment that you had 2 pictures, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the right was a real-time picture, and the one on the left was a previous picture. You could look at the one on the previous picture and notice what the relationship was to the one you're looking at presently. And that's essentially what calibration is about, or sensory acuity. We look across at the other person and we compare the 2 pictures that we're seeing. One picture external, one picture internal, and we notice what's going on. Now, of course, this means in the first place, we're going to have to ask the person for a baseline. This is done by simply asking them, and one of the exercises that we'll do when you come to the practitioner training is we'll do the example, someone you like versus someone you dislike. Now, this is one of the exercises that we do at the NLP practitioner training, where we ask you to get in partnership with someone else and have them think about someone they like, first of all, and then you look at them and notice the skin color, the skin tonus, the breathing, the lower lip size, and the eyes, and anything else you can observe. And then we ask them to think about someone they dislike, and you notice the difference. And what most people are so surprised at is that they can actually see a difference far more easily than they thought. So here's what I'd like to suggest. If you're listening to these tapes at home, spend a couple of days just paying attention to people. Spend a couple of days just actually going out and looking at people and noticing for like one whole day, look at their skin color and notice that you can actually see the difference. One whole day, the skin tonus. So let's go through page 15 now and see exactly what we're looking at. And I'd like you to notice as you go through this that you have seen these in the past, that your unconscious mind certainly has registered these changes that people make, and that it certainly can remember them and begin to utilize them again. All right, let's see what we get. So number 1, skin color, and that's a shift from light to dark. Now, a lot of people, when they do skin color work, they actually look for redness to light colored or to whiteness. But in fact, different people have different colors of skin, obviously. And so we'd like you to calibrate on the lightness to darkness. In fact, the best way to do that is to imagine that the person you're looking at is actually in a black and white photo. Imagine they're in a black and white photo. As you look across at them, notice that the picture gets darker or lighter. And that's going to be you're looking at the difference between those two, you'll notice that you can actually notice the difference between lightness and darkness. The next is skin tonus. Skin tonus means the tone of the muscles or the tension of the muscles, usually underneath the face. One of the things I think you can look for is the shine on the skin. Light usually reflects off of the skin in different ways. Even for a woman who's put on plenty of powder and doesn't have any skin shine, You can even notice the difference in the lightness the light bouncing off the face. Usually what we're looking for skin tonus is symmetrical versus asymmetrical, or not symmetrical. If you pay attention to the symmetry of the face, that will also give you a certain amount of meaning. Number 3 is breathing. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this with people, with yourself or with others, but the breathing will change rate and it'll change location. The rate can go from fast to slow, or from high to low in the body. High means up here by the shoulders. So if you just for a second stop and stick your chest out. Stick your chest way out. Make it nice and big. There you go. Now, put your hands up here just below your, right there. Yeah, right there. That's it. Yeah, right there. And if you put your hands right there, that's the top of your chest, just below your shoulders. Now, if your breathing can be way up there, and someone breathing up there is going to be probably breathing rather fast. Now take your hands and move them down just below your chest, just below your breast, down just right above your diaphragm there, and right around your rib cage. That's the middle of your chest. And people who are auditory often will breathe from there. And they'll be breathing a little more moderately in terms of the speed. Then you could also be breathing way down deep in the belly. And there are some people who are just belly breathers, and you sit and watch them breathe and their belly goes in and out. And it's so funny to watch that person. Now, oftentimes kinesthetic people breathe this way, and they're breathing very slowly. Now, the fast to slow and the high to low aren't necessarily tied together all the time, but many times they are. So you can begin to pay attention to the shift that people go through in breathing. If you want to, you can spend an entire day looking at lower lip size. What most people don't know is that the lower lip changes from moment to moment. Actually, what happens, it gets more blood or less blood in the lower lip. As the lower lip expands and becomes more engorged with blood, there are fewer lines. It becomes more swollen. As it shrinks in size, there become more and more lines. So the easier way to check with the lower lip size is to look at the lines and also the thickness of the lower lip from up to down. Number 5, the eyes. And the eyes will change focus and pupil dilation. The focus could become focused or defocused, and the pupil dilation could change from dilated to undilated. And you want to look at that also. Now, as we mentioned in this exercise previously, as we look from like to dislike, as we look at the difference between like and dislike, what you're going to do when we do the exercise at the practitioner training is you're actually going to look at the person's skin color and skin tonus and breathing, lower lip size, eyes. You might also look at the tilt of their head, their eyebrows, and so forth. Look at their entire face as you ask them to think about someone they like. Then ask them to think about someone they dislike and look at the difference. And what 99% of the people find who attend our practitioner training is that they're easily able to see very, very quickly the difference between someone that the person they're working with likes and someone that they dislike. Now, I'd like you to try this before you get there so that you already know that you can do this. If you'd like to, that would be great. Why don't you, for the rest of the day, just go out and talk to some people and notice the differences in their skin color, their skin tonus, the breathing, the lower lip size, and their eyes, what they do with their eyes. And also notice what other things you can begin to notice. What'll happen is if you do, you'll actually be able to see things. You'll actually be able to see things that people had not seen before, or it'll seem like you're a magician in terms of being able to observe. And that's what Erickson could do, of course. Master communicators of all time have been able to observe people in this way. Master communicators like Milton Erickson, as I said, even though he noticed the pulse on the woman's leg so clearly, it still took him some time to practice, and he practiced while watching his baby sister learn how to walk, of course. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go out and practice this in the next couple of days. Get a real familiarity with watching people's skin color and skin tonus, watching the shift that occurs with their skin color and skin tonus, watching the shift in breathing and the lower lip size as it changes. Watch their eyes and watch the other things that you can notice about their body. And really, really become a master of observing other people. If you do, you'll become a master communicator. And as you do that, what you'll find is that you've got more and more joy, not only fun in communicating, because you can actually see what kind of results you're producing, but in addition, you'll be able to look across at the other person and know the results and be able to improve your results. It's just like getting up to bat, in baseball. If you get up to bat enough times, you're bound to get a hit eventually. Okay, let's move on and look at rapport now, and let's turn to page 16. And one of the major things that master communicators have had for a very, very long time is the ability to get into rapport with their audience. Whether you're communicating one-on-one or with groups of people, and whether you're communicating in business or education or therapy, rapport is a very, very important process. Now, in hypnosis, rapport means that state where the subject in hypnosis accepts suggestions uncritically, which are given to him by the hypnotherapist. But NLP talks more about rapport as a process. And rapport as a process really was not talked about much before NLP. In fact, this is one of the great offerings that NLP has given to the world, is how do you actually establish that state? How do you actually get into that state where your communication is uncritically accepted by the people to whom you're communicating? That's really important. In essence, it's an almost magical state where the subject actually listens to you very carefully at the unconscious level. And I think one of the major gifts that NLP has given us is in denominalizing the process of rapport. That is, denominalizing means taking it from a word which is a nominalization. That's a noun, a process word that's a noun, but actually refers to a process. And turning it back into a series of steps of how do you gain rapport. So this segment is about how you gain rapport with other people. How do you set up a condition when you're communicating with someone wherein you're communicating directly with their unconscious mind? What rapport does is it allows for that communication directly to go directly into the unconscious mind of the client. Now, the NLP theory of rapport is based on a study that was originally done in 1970 at the University of Pennsylvania by a guy named Robert Birdwhistle. And the name of the study was Kinesics and Communication. And what Birdwhistle discovered was that in communication, only roughly 7% of the communication, when we're communicating with somebody, ends up being the words that we use. And a whopping 38% of communication is communicated by the tone of voice. And an even greater 55% of communication is communicated by the physiology. That is the physiology that we use in the process of communicating. Now, I'll bet you thought your words were important, and they are important. Words are important. In fact, that's how we tell people, that's how we ask people to do something. But the fact is that a lot more, actually 93% of what we communicate is unconscious and communicated unconsciously to the unconscious mind. Now, obviously, the Birdwhistle study was probably somewhat biased because he began looking at kinesics and communication, so he was looking at physiology anyway. But the fact is that what that really means is that a lot of what we're communicating is communicated unconsciously to the client. And so if we're communicating unconsciously to the client, we want to consciously use that unconscious communication. We want to consciously use that unconscious communication. So let's see. How do you begin to consciously establish rapport with someone at the unconscious level? How do you begin to establish communication with the client's unconscious mind? And that's the key for rapport. How do you begin establishing communication with the unconscious mind? And the way you do is you become like them. It's a known fact that when people are like each other, they like each other. So rapport is a process of responsiveness. It's a process where we get into communication with someone and we find common things. Usually when people get together, they go, well, where did you go to school? And if they find, oh, they went to the same school, then they're buddies. Or where did you go to the university? Well, I went to this university. Or where did you grow up? Or, did you have your teeth straightened? Have you colored your hair? How tall are you? What kind of problems have you had? And usually then they find common ground. They find a common ground consciously when people are attempting to establish rapport with each other. But NLP, the rapport in NLP is more about establishing an unconscious common ground. It's, for example, when you match and mirror someone, what happens is you're doing it outside of the client's awareness, and you're establishing a common ground where the unconscious mind can begin to look across at you and say, this person is just like me. And so we'll either match the client or we'll mirror them in NLP to establish rapport. Now, there's a difference between matching and mirroring, and let me explain to you what they are. So, assuming you're in a place where you can actually do this safely, why don't you raise your right hand? Just go ahead and raise your right hand as if you're raising your hand to ask a question. Okay, did you do that? Okay, good. Now, I'm going to raise my left hand. If you raise your right hand, notice it looks as if you're looking in a mirror. And that's called mirroring. So I would actually act as though I were mirroring you back to you. Now, if you raise your right hand and I raise my right hand, I'm actually matching you. That looks like less of a mirror, but yet I'm still doing the same thing that you are, and that's called matching in NLP. Now, the first thing you've got to say to yourself is, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that because I'll get caught. But you won't get caught, I promise you, unless you're too overt about it. The best rapport occurs at the unconscious level. The best rapport occurs outside of the client's conscious awareness. So whenever you're doing processes that will lead you to rapport, whenever you're matching or mirroring, make sure that the matching or mirroring that you do is subtle, that it's outside of the client's awareness. For example, if I'm talking and I'm gesturing with my hands with big, expansive gestures, hey, how's it going? And I'm moving my hands in a certain way with expansive gestures, then your gestures should be expansive, but not while I'm doing my gestures. You would use your gestures when it's time for you to talk. I've only actually had one person since I've been doing rapport, and that was very early on in my NLP days. I've actually only had one person since I've been doing rapport actually call me on matching or mirroring them. And this person said, hey, it was actually, as I remember, it was a chiropractor on Long Island, and he had actually taken an NLP training. So I was coming in to talk to him, and we were talking to him about business consulting. And I sat down and began matching and mirroring him. And when I did, he looked at me and he said, you're matching and mirroring me. I know what you're doing. And so I laughed and I said, oh, am I? And then I shifted positions, so I wasn't in the same position he was. But I must have already had rapport with him, because after a few minutes, he shifted into the state. He shifted into that same, the sitting the same way I was, the same tilt of the head, etc. And he was matching and mirroring me. And I looked at him and I said, see, you're doing it again. And then he said, oh no, and he never mentioned it again. So the fact is that matching and mirroring needs to be subtle. And when you're going to do it, you want to be very subtle about it, be very unobtrusive. If it stays outside of the client's awareness, it'll be absolutely the most effective. Now, I remember one time I was staying in Anchorage, Alaska, and I really, really needed rapport, but I didn't know it till this happened. I checked into this hotel, and I'd let my office, we were doing business consulting in Anchorage for a while, and I had checked into this hotel, and I have to admit that this was not the kind of hotel that I would normally stay in. In fact, I got up to my room, and it smelled like old cigarettes, and there was a shag carpet on the floor, and you know how long it's been since anybody had a shag carpet anywhere in their house, and the shag carpet was ripped, and the chairs were ripped, and I was going, oh, no. Here I am, I'm going to talk to my clients, and I'm going to talk to them about prosperity, and I'm staying in this motel that's just awful. And I thought, well, this just won't work for me. So I grabbed my suitcase, I went back to the front desk, and I said, look, I really can't stay here, but thanks a lot. Gave them their key back and hopped in my car, and I didn't have a reservation. And it was really the busy season in Anchorage, and I didn't have a reservation, and I drove to the north. And I came to the next motel I came to, and I drove into the motel, and I got out of the car, and I walked up to the front desk, and I said, boy, I'm in trouble. If I ever needed rapport, because I knew that all the major hotels were like totally booked, and the place was really packed, and I knew that I was in big trouble. So I walked up to the clerk at the front desk, and I as I walked up to the clerk at the front desk, she was bending down, had her hands on the front desk, and I matched and mirrored her with my physiology, and I talked the way I assumed she would talk, and actually did a pretty good job of approximating what her voice was, because and I mirrored her posture. And as she looked up, I noticed that we went into rapport immediately. How did I notice that? I noticed that because I was paying attention to the skin color, the skin tonus, the breathing, the lower lip size, and the eyes, the pupil focus and dilation. So as I looked up, I noticed we went into rapport almost immediately. And I said to her, I'm in big trouble. I really need a room. And she said, we're really booked up. She said, but I'm going to go back and ask the manager what I can do to find you a room. So I waited and I waited and I waited, and finally she came back and she said, "I found you a room, Dr. James. It's in this part of the hotel, and we're so happy to have you there." And I checked into a really nice hotel. The fact is that rapport is marvelous. It's just really a wonderful thing to know. It's great to use when you need it. It's also great to use when you simply want to get your message across and be able to communicate to people. It's something which I'm really pleased that I know. And if you use it on a regular basis, you certainly will find that your communication will improve and you'll be able to communicate virtually with anyone. If you're in selling, rapport is the end of the turnover. You know, turnover essentially happens when we can't establish rapport sufficiently with a client that we're working with. In therapy, what it means is that your clients will uncritically accept the suggestions you give them. So this is something I think that's really good to do. So I think that in the next few days and weeks, you should practice rapport. Hopefully even until you come to the training. I would practice matching and mirroring people so that I knew when I was getting into rapport with them and when I wasn't. Using your sensory acuity that you've already practiced, I hope, and using now your new rapport skills, I want you to practice so that you can establish rapport with anyone as quickly as you possibly can. So let's look and see what we're going to match or mirror. And you don't have to do all of this. You only have to do some of it or enough of it to get into rapport with someone. So the first thing I do is when I sit down next to someone, I'm going to adopt their physiology slowly as I sit down. But by the time I'm fully sitting down, I'll probably be sitting the same way they are. What am I adopting? I'm adopting their posture. Are they leaning to the left or the right with their back? If they're sitting in a chair, is their buttocks all the way back toward the back of the chair, or is it out toward the front edge of the chair? Are they leaning backwards in the chair, or are they sitting up rather straight? What does the spine look like? Is the spine upright and straight? Does it lean to the left or to the right? I'm going to adopt their gestures. I'm going to match their gestures. Not all the time. Like if they're speaking, I'm not going to be doing gestures at the same time they are. But when it's my turn to speak, I'll be gesturing. I could even adopt their facial expression, the tilt of their head, their breathing, and their blinking. I could adopt all of those. I could use the same facial expressions. I could even blink synchronized with them. I could even blink essentially at the same time. And it's such a powerful thing to match a person's breathing. It's such a powerful thing to match someone else's breathing, to get their breathing in the same time, so that when they breathe in, you breathe in. Now, here's a tip. When a person's speaking, they're breathing out. So while they're speaking, you're going to be breathing out. Then when they stop to take a breath, then you can breathe in at the same time. So that's matching physiology. And breathing is a very, very important part of that. Conrad E. Leitner, who was a great stage show hypnotist, and Leitner was quoted in Andre Weitzenhofer in 1957 in General Techniques of Hypnotism. Conrad E. Leitner said, "The most important thing that I do is when I'm doing my stage show is I get my audience to breathe in unison with me." He said, "I don't breathe in unison with them. I get my audience to breathe in unison with me." Now that's rather telling, isn't it? He gets his audience to breathe in unison with him. So he gets them to match him. And what he did was he used to raise his arms above his head. He'd say, "Okay, audience, take a deep breath in." And he'd go, and as he took his deep breath in, he'd raise his hands above his head till they were fully extended when the audience breathed all the way in. And then as they breathed out, he would lower his arms. Now, Leitner was then actually doing what we call crossover mirroring. Now, crossover mirroring means, although he was breathing at the same time too, but crossover mirroring means that you're actually mirroring something that someone else is doing with a different part of your body. So by raising his arms above, from below his waist to above the top of his head as the audience was breathing in, he's using a different part of his body to mirror the clients, or the audience in this case, to mirror them. I remember one time I was working with a 9-year-old boy, this was the skateboarder actually, and he had this thing where he was sitting there with his foot. Let me see if I can approximate what he was doing with his foot. Can you hear that? He was sitting there with his foot like this, going boom, 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 boom. And his foot stomping on the floor like this, stomping. And I'm thinking, whoa, if I sit there and try to do this with my foot, it's going to be rather obvious. So what did I do? I matched him with my hand, slowly with my hand, slightly on the couch like this. just hand going up and down, up and down, up and down, and I just the finger going up and down. Then I finally got rapport, and then I slowed it down, and slowed it down, and then I stopped. And he stopped. And then I went, whew, that's a lot better. So if someone is producing a behavior that's really overt, like a child, and you really want to slow them down a little bit, get into rapport with them and then slow it down kinesthetically till it gets slower and slower, and then eventually it stops. Good. So that's physiology. We can match physiology. Now we can also match the voice. Now, voice matching is extremely powerful on the telephone, and one of the things we teach our telephone salespeople when I do telephone sales trainings is to match the tone of voice as quickly as possible. Now, what are we going to match? We're going to match the pitch of the voice, the tone. Now, oftentimes, if you have a woman talking to a man or a man talking to a woman, you're not going to get exactly the same tonality. But here's my suggestion. My suggestion is if you're a woman and you're talking to a man, if the man is talking in the high range of tonality for a man, like up here, he's talking way up here and you're talking way up there, then you would raise your voice slightly until you got right up to the high pitch for a woman. And if the man's talking in terms of a low pitch for a man or low tone for a man, then the woman would drop her tone into the low range for a woman. Obviously, it's not very good. If you're sounding like Mickey Mouse and you're talking to someone, that's going to be really in consciousness. So the thing is to shift your tonality so that it's in the high range for a man or a woman if you're talking to someone of the opposite sex. If you're talking to someone of the same sex, then you can match the tone, the tonality, by simply being in the same range as they are. So you can match the pitch. You can also match the tempo. You pick up the phone sometimes, and some people, they go like this. They go, hello. And you go, whoa, this person's going really, really slow. And so you just take a deep breath. And you slow way down and you go, hello. If you match the tempo that the person's speaking, whether they're speaking really, and some people, you call people from the East Coast, you've been really relaxed, you call somebody East Coast, they go, hello, how you doing? Hey, what's going on? How's it going? And you're talking really fast like that. You can match the speed. You can pick up your speed and match the speed that way. Now, the timbre is the quality of the voice. Some voices are very, very clear and crisp and sharp. Other voices are very, very raspy. And you can talk in a raspy voice if you want to. So there's the timbre of the voice. And then there's the loudness. And some people talk really loud on the phone. They go, hello. And some people talk really quietly. They go like this. They go like this. Hello. How's it going? And so you can match the loudness of the voice as you're talking to the person. This is really, really effective in telephone sales, to match the voice as you come right into the phone call right the very first time, just to totally match the voice. Or you can match the voice when you're with someone in person. The neat thing about voice is that it's one of the underrepresented representational systems in our world today. I think auditory was more highly represented previously when there were more storytellers, more bards, more poets, more singers singing songs. Today, of course, I think we're watching more TV and more movies, and so visual is more highly represented than auditory. So that makes it very good because auditory is usually outside of people's awareness, and you can match their auditory tonality, tempo, timbre, and volume, and gain rather rapid rapport by doing that. Okay, next is the words. What words? Well, first of all, you can match their predicates, and we're going to talk about predicates shortly. You can match their keywords. One time we were in, where were we? We were in Orange County in California, and we were talking to a company called California Shutters. And I was doing a business consulting enrollment for one of our offices in Orange County, and we were talking to this fellow, and he said something really, really, which was unusual and quite interesting. About, I would say, a half an hour into the interview, and he said this. He said, a consulting relationship, if I'm going to get into a consulting relationship, it needs to be valid in and of itself. And the words were unusual, so I kind of wrote them down. And he went on, and he talked for another half hour and told me what he needed and what he wanted. And then again, he mentioned the words valid in and of itself. And so when he said to me, so what can you do for me? I said, well, first of all, I really want you to understand that any consulting relationship that you enter into needs to be valid in and of itself. And he went, yes, and slammed his hand on the table. And he said, yes, this is exactly what I've been looking for. So by listening carefully to a person's key words, that's very important to pay attention to. And if you find some key words that are particularly idiosyncratic, which means specific to the person who's using them, or if you find some key words that are out of the ordinary, by all means, utilize those as quickly as you can. Utilize them, give them 5 minutes or so, and then feed them back to the person. Okay, the next thing is common experiences and associations. And of course, this is what most people look for when they get into attempt to get into rapport with people. Did you go to the same school? Did you come from the same part of the country? Where did you go to high school? So forth and so on. Those are the kind of things that people usually use in establishing rapport, and of course they're valuable because we know that they do work. And then finally, content chunks, and that means how do people group their words? Some people group their words in very short blocks. And so when they talk, they actually have only very short groups of words the way that they talk, and then they pause in between each one so that each word is separated and it goes on and it begins to get into a certain rhythm, and you can feel that rhythm. So if you match that rhythm, and of course I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but if you match that rhythm of content chunks, or the way they chunk their words, or the way they group their words together, if you find something that's unusual or something you can notice, then that's how I would do it. Good. So that's rapport. And rapport is so very valuable. And it's something that's absolutely marvelous in terms of producing results, because it will allow you to begin to get into greater communication with people. It will allow you to be able to communicate your ideas regardless of content, and I think that's important. To be able to communicate to someone regardless of content in a way that your message will be heard, it'll get through. Now, the next best thing to do is to begin to practice this. And I think probably you ought to practice this. If you're listening to this series with a partner, then perhaps you could do an exercise. If not, perhaps you could grab someone to do an exercise with you and begin to match and mirror them. I think if there are a couple of you who are going to be taking the training together, then you could practice this on your own and match or mirror the person you're with. Now, when you're doing that, you're paying attention to posture, noticing especially the spine, the gestures, the facial expressions, the blinking and the breathing. You can match their voice tonality exactly when you ask or when you're talking to them or when they're talking to you. And you can actually pay attention to all of that and match and mirror that. If they're doing the talking, of course, it's a lot easier than if you're doing the talking. I'd like you to practice this sometime during the next couple of days. If you would, hopefully you've already practiced the sensory acuity so you can actually see what's going on with a person and notice what's happening with them as you're talking to them. And I'd like you to be cognizant of paying attention to matching and mirroring now. Begin to match or mirror your partner. Pick someone. You could even do it in business. You could match or mirror someone and get into rapport with them. Now, here's what's going to happen. And these are not in your notes. You may want to write these down on page 16. This is how you use this. This is exactly what makes this work. These are 4 indicators of rapport. And these are not traditional NLP, but there's something that I've noticed that goes on. So here's what happens. The first indicator of rapport for the practitioner, that's you, is a feeling of warmth inside yourself. So the minute you sit down and you match or mirror someone, you may notice a feeling. It's usually around the center of the body, the midline of the body from up to down. It could be a feeling of nervousness or butterflies in the stomach, but some sort of feeling inside yourself. The second indicator of rapport is a color change, usually that will start from the neck up, and you'll begin then to see it in the client's face or coloring. You may begin to see a blush even. You may feel it in yourself first and then see it in the other person. If you don't feel it in yourself and see it in them first, that's fine. And that happens within about a minute following the first indicator of rapport. So the first one is you'll feel sort of a feeling inside yourself of warmth or something around the midline. And then a color change occurs in you and then them. And then the third indicator of rapport, and this is an optional indicator, is where the client usually says something like, I feel I've known you before. Or they might say, are you a Leo? Or they might say, I feel like I've known you in a past life. This is a common statement for people who've just gotten into rapport with each other. It's that sort of at-home feeling, that feeling of being at one with the other person. And as I said, this may or may not happen. Sometimes some people don't say anything. But the fourth indicator of rapport is what's commonly taught in NLP as what happens after pacing. Pacing is matching and mirroring someone. And then what happens after that is leading. And leading means that you'll shift position, and then they will follow you into the new position. If a client's in rapport, they'll feel like they have to shift position when you do. So if you've actually gotten the other three indicators of rapport, for example, and let's say your left leg was crossed over your right leg, if you were to switch and cross the other leg over, theoretically, if the client was in the same position as you are, they would feel a desire to shift themselves and would actually shift in the chair right after you did. So from now on, what I'd like to suggest is when you're working with people in your career, or when you're doing NLP with a client, or in business consulting or education, that you actually get into rapport with the person you're working with. For purposes of learning rapport, it's easier to do it on a regular basis. And even if you do it unconsciously already, if you bring it back into consciousness for the purpose of learning it now, what'll happen is you'll get better at it. You may or may not be comfortable as you do this. Of course, I'm going to suggest that you be comfortable, but a lot of times early on when someone's learning rapport, it can feel like it's a little contrived, or it may feel like, gee, are they going to find me out? This is not unusual. This may happen. If you feel like this inside, I don't mean they may find you out. I mean it may happen that you feel this way. But if you're very subtle about it, and of course NLP rapport is based on your being subtle. It's based on you not bringing the awareness of rapport into their consciousness, which means you do have to be quite subtle at it. But even if you practice it on a regular basis, what will happen is you'll get very, very good at it. And you can match somebody very quickly. You can do it unobtrusively. If I were to have a goal for you, my goal would be you could walk into an office, if you're using it in business, and literally sit down next to someone and unobtrusively gain rapport with them in a matter of moments. Just walk in, sit down, assume the same position, assume the same head tilt, posture, etc. And in a matter of moments, you'd be in instantaneous rapport with someone. It doesn't have to be real obvious, but when we're all done, you'll be sitting the same way as the other person is. And what I'd like you to do is do enough of these so that you can get the feeling inside yourself, that you can get the color change in the other person, and then you can be leading them. And when the leading occurs, you can shift, and then they'll follow you, and they'll stay in rapport with you, and they'll be in rapport with you for a long, long time. Oh, you know the story of the clerk that I met? I mentioned the story of the clerk that I met in Anchorage. 2 days, this is so funny, 2 days later, she told a guy what a wonderful person I was. She said, oh yeah, Tad James is a great guy. And she and I had only talked for about 10 minutes. And that's simply the use of rapport. Well, then the next step is pacing, and that's where you can move quickly with the client. Sometimes you have to slow it down, but you can begin to move quickly with the client, and they'll be following your lead in essence. Now, I still believe in rapport. Some NLP trainers no longer teach rapport, but I really strongly believe in rapport. I, however, believe rapport should be used sparingly, and here's where you should use it sparingly. I think it's inappropriate for you to match and mirror clients who are agitated, or clients who are depressed, or clients who have clinical problems, including physiological symptomology, or if a client's in a state which is inappropriate for you to be in. And if that's the case, you should use crossover mirroring. And crossover mirroring is where you mirror a portion of the person's overt physiology with another portion of your own physiology. Now, Erickson did this all the time. Erickson was crippled, and he had polio, and so he couldn't match a person totally. But I saw a tape of him once crossover mirroring a client by matching the client's breathing with his finger. So you can always do that. You can always mirror a client by doing crossover mirroring if you have to. And I think it is inappropriate for you to be in rapport with someone who's not really in great shape, physiologically or psychologically. I think also you should do rapport. The best time to do rapport, of course, is when it's a win-win situation. And I think you should keep in mind that it should be a win-win situation each time you do rapport. That each time you do rapport, you want to make sure that it's used for a positive intent on your part and a positive intent for the other person. I'm opposed to manipulation of any kind, and I think rapport should be used always in a win-win situation. The difference between manipulation and non-manipulation, in my opinion, is your intent. I think it has a lot to do with intention. My point of view is that if your intention is positive for the client, and if you have the client's highest ecology in mind, And then it's not possible to manipulate them. And in fact, rapport actually brings it into a win-win situation. Actually, the fact is, when you get into rapport with someone else, they get into rapport with you, and I think actually that would be the best way to proceed. It's especially useful in business because, quite frankly, when you're in rapport with someone else, they're in rapport with you. It's impossible for each person then to get into a situation where there's one-upmanship. So I like rapport from that point of view. It really brings it home and really puts it on a really good level. Okay, so here's what we're going to look at next. Next, we're going to move on and we're going to look at representational systems. But before we actually move on and look at representational systems, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take the representational system preference test. Now, in order to do that, let's see, what page is that on? You're going to have to turn to page 17. So would you please, just for a moment, go ahead and turn to page 17 in your notebook. Go ahead and turn to page 17 in your notebook. There you go. Page 17 in your notebook. Yep. And if you notice, it says here, representational system preference test. And I'd like you to, it says here, use the following system to indicate your preferences. Number 4 is the closest to describing you. Number 3 is the next best description. Number 2 is the next best. And number 1 is the least descriptive of you. So if you fill in that on page 17, and then you transfer your answers over to page 18, you should get a pretty clear idea of whether you're visual or auditory or kinesthetic. That's useful before we go on and talk about predicates and representational systems. So if you're listening to this program, why don't you do that before you actually move on to the next program? So just go ahead and take a moment to fill out the representational system preference test before you move on to the next program in this series. And this is the end of number 4. Come back and join us for number 5, why don't you?